in AI and cultural preservation. So in this research, I really wanted to ask, what is it possible when our objective is cultural creation and preservation instead of scale or profit? So there are the very real impacts of the climate crisis and the extractive nature of AI the extractive nature of AI in terms of industry practice, in terms of its like infrastructure. So there has to be another possible world. And how do we do that with small AI in ways that are small and reverberate through like larger systems? And rethinking about narratives and ecologies around technology, what is it like if people are not a footnote, but at the center of what AI means? I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but it doesn't get practiced very often. Today, in talking about small AI, I want to challenge this idea of AI having to be big or scalable by exploring its potential as a tool for introspection or reflection. And how does AI shift in shape and form when infused with unique values or geographies and cultural landscapes? By taking the focus away from relentless scalability and profit-driven models, what opportunities are there to reimagine our ways of working with AI in a way that aligns with the flourishing of ourselves and our natural world? So in terms of rethinking large-scale models, we have, in terms of rethinking large-scale models, like this maybe looks into more DIY or even lo-fi possibilities and asking questions and moving to rhythms and patterns situated in places and with peoples. It's an invitation to use notions of, for me, I like, in terms of vibes, I like fractals, friction, fragmentedness, to think beyond ruins where things might grow in between the cracks. That's me. But we have two guests today. We have Vera Vanderberg, and she combines practical design with scholarly investigation, exploring AI's role in the creative process. She has presented at events like the Dutch Design Week and I'm only going to say this wrong, and the Salon de Mobile in Milan. And we have Linda, I have never said your name out loud, Linda Dounia Rebeiz. Yeah. Works with speculative archiving, with excluded ways of being, and developing AI models that explore what we have lost. In 2023, Linda was recognized for her work on Time 100's list of most influential people in AI for her work, her really beautiful work, Once Upon a Garden. Okay, so if we want to get started, I don't know, Vera, if you want to chat a bit to us about your work and what it's about. Yeah.
Sure. Hello, my name is Vera. I am currently in Amsterdam and I work in Delft. I am in a PhD trajectory, so I am in my fourth year of a PhD in which I research. It started off with researching AI in creative design practice and researching how you could use AI models in your creative practice in order to make that practice better. I'm a practitioner artist as well, artist/designer. I always find myself one way or the other, but I feel like it's going more towards an artistic direction. And halfway through my PhD, or maybe a little bit earlier, I found a direction in which I'm mainly focused on using AI for as a reflexive tool, which basically means instead of using AI as a way to optimize or to smoothen creative work, I try to find a goal for it to help artists, makers reflect on themselves and on their positions in the world, but also on the reason why they make stuff, why they like certain stuff. And practically that means that I do a lot of model training, but mainly with the people involved. So for example, I work a lot with object detection models. And in that case, I work with other artists, designers to train object detection models based on the way they look at a certain topic. So there's a lot of things that come looking at that. So we do critical data collection and curation. We do the annotation in a specific subjective way. And so up until now, I've been mainly working with object detection, and currently I'm also trying to work with text-to-image models. So I'll really try to think from the model and think about what are the limits of these models and how can we kind of bypass them, stretch it up a little bit, and also with these ideas in mind do we need it to be big? Can it also be small? can we fine tune? Can we, by using very small comprehensible data sets for one person, still get valuable results? And then exactly what actually is a result and when does a model perform? And I think in my research right now, we realize that the training process of such a model is just as important as using the model as a tool. So in every practice that I do together with others or with myself, the training process becomes this really nice, stretched out, almost reflexive journey throughout one's practice, which basically makes it very slow. So my research also goes very slow. Obviously, research goes way slower than technical development, but because I really take the time to really think about what can be a data set, what can be the annotation task, how do we steer this annotation task towards what goal, and then how do we work with the output if all these steps goals are to be reflexive about one's position or your own views. So that's basically in a very general abstract way what I do. So I try to write articles, papers, publish in academic events, but on the same time, I also try to maintain certain artistic practice and exhibit, for example, installations where I try to inform people about this practice. I really like to show the process to people and really like to show whatever is behind such a system that now is so obscure and easy in your interface, but there's actually so much more behind. And yeah, I just want to say I started working with AI because I thought it was a remarkable technology and super, super interesting that you could actually teach a system something about you. It's just such a shame that it grew out to be this very big thing that needs to be such a solution for everyone. And I feel like if we try to release these models from that pressure in a way, that it's actually a pretty interesting technology that we can learn a lot from. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. And then I think we can now move to Linda, if you want to just say a bit about your work and who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sweet. Yes, I'm Linda. I'm a Senegalese artist, formerly designer, but really just a designer also. I just made the transition to full-time artist a few years ago, but I still find myself designing. Yeah, I got into AI from the work of the Algorithmic Justice League. And at the time, I was interested in facial recognition software and why it disproportionately sort of mislabeled and targeted Black bodies. And that sort of led into a rabbit hole of wondering what is invisible in the data sets that are used to train AI. And then that led me to an even, which I think more interesting question for me, which is what's not even, let's forget invisible, what's just not recorded. So I kind of started doing a lot of research into, okay, what's featured in some of the data sets, obviously the ones that we know anything about, which by the way is the hardest thing to do in this industry, is to find out what stuff is trained on. From there, kind of look into my surrounding and environment and kind of use a very, contextual lived experience approach to decide what do I feel isn't being represented, and using that kind of as a starting point for what can constitute a data set, a database to train with. And yeah, so I love training my own models. I feel like it's almost at this point, when I started, it felt like most people were doing that because that's around the time, that's I think a couple of years before ChatGPT or anything, Midjourney was out. And so if you were working with AI, you were probably training. And then all of a sudden that changed. So working with GANs right now and training your own work on training with your own data it's kind of like almost like a resistance, like you're a dinosaur, like you're like in extinction, like you're going to be obsolete very soon. But which is why I enjoy it, because through my work, I really want people to fall in love with small AI, to realize that potentially the power of what this technology we have is in small, specific, contextual, tasks and not necessarily rush towards AGI so fast. Yeah, that's how I started building this archive of endangered and critically endangered and extinct flora from the Sahel region, because I felt like that was the least documented thing about my world that even locally is not really well documented, that I knew for a fact would be absent from data sets. And I'm working with around 115 species from this region, for which we have very little photographic evidence, if any. And most of these species, the only digital record we have are herbarium pages. So we may never know, actually, we will never know what these flowers look like, if they're extinct or not, because the last survey dates back to 2015. And yeah, so the project was really, it was one curiosity that turned into a 4-year project at this point. But it's sort of using AI to imagine what these flowers might have looked like. And yeah, the process of building the data set was very interesting. It made me even learn more about local archives and how those are maintained and how those are built and who's funding them and why it's so hard to get data about certain parts of the world, because there's no political government, like there's no political will to do any of that work, and what that means in terms of wanting to fight to be represented by data sets that are used for larger models. Yeah.
Okay, really amazing. And actually, I'm gonna ask permission. Victor, you're here from Smut Kitchen, and I've seen you before. Victor also does a small AI project, but I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about Smut Kitchen since you're here, and I think it's kind of cool for everyone to know what it is. If you want, you can say no.
Maybe
nothing like putting him on the spot.
Hi, Nadia, and also hi, Vera. Nice to see you, both of you again. Just 2 sentences, because I find it's really fascinating that we're talking about small AI, and it resonates with so much. I'm also trying to look into. We had a field test recently in Basel at the Academy of Arts and Design with 7 participants, so it was slightly participatory, and we were thinking about how to teach a machine to distribute a resource, which was unsold but edible food, rescued food. And we actually, now that you are talking about small AI, we might have done something like this, but it was partly simulated. So people were negotiating how they would distribute food, what would be a fair distribution. We agreed on the kind of data that we would like to provide, so people would enter data into an interface about what's in their kitchens, and then we would agree on the rules of distribution. Like negotiations went into a protocol, and the protocol we used to actually label the data, and then we were teaching, the participants had an interface for teaching an algorithm, and then a courier from a food saving organization, Food Angels, for a week, and then a second week every morning was looking at what food is available in their depot, entering it, and then the algorithm would tell the food courier which kitchen should it go. So it didn't work, like really, but it did work somehow, and it was small. But so many questions were arising whether this is feasible. But the question never arose whether this is, desirable, interesting. So I'm really looking forward to hear more about your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, right now I want to open the space for questions, but I thought maybe, I don't know if Vera and Linda, if you have questions for each other now that you've heard a bit about each other's work, or even for me, if you guys have thought about anything you might want to ask. Or you could even, yeah.
I think I have a question, if I can. Yeah?
Yeah.
So I have an issue more than a question. I'm just curious to see how other people deal with it, because I keep on getting this back from basically people from the computer science field saying, like, when I talk about small AI, what I get back is that they say, yeah, but to train models in first instance, you need to train it big, because if you don't train it big, then it doesn't work. So for example, what my issue is now with text-to-image models is that I really would like to make a small text-to-image model, but it works so well because it's trained on so many images, right? And fine-tuning is obviously a very small part, but then still the basis of this model is based on big. So I'm just curious to think, is it okay then to call what you do with fine-tuning, for example, small? Or are we still dependent on the fact that these models are trained in such a massive amount? I just sometimes cannot seem to figure it out, and sometimes I find myself a bit of a fraud. So maybe Linda or Nadia, you have some ideas on this.
Yeah, I did ask myself that question as well, because I had a big issue with StyleGAN at some point, which was trained on Flickr faces. And there's obviously a pretty bias. Let alone just like the Eurocentric bias. Like there's just a pretty bias. Like Flickr photos are usually attractive people. But I found out that small and narrow still applies to all these models we use today, even though they're trained on a database we can comprehend with our like it's trillions of pieces of information. But it's still small and narrow, because essentially what I understand to be big AI is AGI. That's really the next stage. It's like, if it's able to do everything, like if it combines an LLM and a text to image and all the other applications we can think of together and does it with like as little supervision and as well as human can, then we've moved from the small AI stage. But I hear you that it doesn't feel small at all.
I don't know if this applies, but you guys can tell me. I was in a talk with, I was not in a talk, I was watching a talk by Forensics Architecture, and I thought one of the interesting uses that they had for AI currently was to find people, so then you can only use one person's face. If you like kind of shift the lens on creating versus finding, I think that's like an interesting perspective, especially since, but I don't know where to take that. But yeah, within their work, they use AI mostly to find and for people to like do recognition. So they have a person there to like support like finding people and places and things. And then in which case the data set is like super tiny. But I guess I do have a question. So in creating your data sets, is there anything that you found surprising in defining what a data set is that you may not have expected from before? Do you want to share?
Yeah. My data set was like a bunch of holes. Like the holes were the most important part of the data set. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's like,
no.
Like within the question I was interested in, like, let's just say, which flowers did my great-grandmother grew up with, right? Like if I were to answer that question using a data set, the answer, like the actual data points I had to rely on were just so few, and everything else was just a bunch of holes, right? So at that point, I was like, is it possible? And is it still a data set if you're speculating at the data set level? Because if you think about like AI outputs being like speculations or hallucinations, or I don't know, like an average of whatever they're learning, which is not reality, could you call the same process of building the data set using that same type of generation also a data, like, is that a valid data set? Like that's the biggest question I have for my project, because it includes essentially images that I made up using AI to train AI, just because there were so many holes, right? But then it also sort of mirrors where we're headed with training. Like increasingly we're producing data with AI that's then used to train AI, right? There's going to be a point where human data production cannot be as fast as AI data production. And I mean, if you've seen like all the AI images out there, the mediocrity of that, just to give us more of that, just kind of like scares me a little bit. So my question is always like, what is a data set? If it's not real and it's not based on reality, can you still call that a data set?
What is real? Anyway, so Vera, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Well, I thought that you couldn't train a model on synthetic data because then it would collapse. So that's also why they're not retraining ChatGPT, because if you train it on generated data, the model collapses, which I think is the most extreme. If you think about that conceptually, model collapse because you train a model on its own data. It's like a snake eating its own tail, so it will disappear. So it needs real data, whatever that is. And then I was thinking, what then is real data? That means it has human manipulation. So either it can still be synthetic data that is manipulated by you in a certain way and then put back, or it's something from reality, photographs, whatever. It needs real data. So I think for me, that's also very interesting, given that even though we are making models that are producing so much stuff synthetically, that can never fully go back into that same system. So then what do we do with all that content? I don't know. So that was one thing that I the other thing, yeah, do you want to respond, Linda?
Yeah, 100%. It's mind blowing. I mean, it's really hard to wrap your head around it, especially if you consider that for some artists whose work have been used without permission, for example, if you Google their names, that you'll find 10x the amount of artworks they've actually produced that are labeled to be their artwork. So it's only the artist who can ascertain whether that image is synthetic or not. So I wonder whether models, data scrapers, because you're not, when you're scraping the internet for data to train with, how can you tell if all data is labeled to that same artist? Like, can you, I mean, do we have the means to actually determine over time everything that's produced synthetically to a degree of fidelity that allows us to say this is definitely a real data point, this existed, or this is made by a person?
If I can just jump in, one of the conversations, so like a research stream, tangential, well, in AIXD, related-ish to this topic is an exploration of the use of cultural heritage imagery, existing images, to make, quote, better images of AI. So like, what are the narratives of AI that we want to proliferate? There's a great nonprofit, I think they're a nonprofit organization called Better Images of AI. It's a stock photo library of things that aren't Terminators or like creation fingers touching. What are some better visual narratives that we can use both in mainstream and in academia to promote more nuanced narratives of AI? Anyways, there is a side quest question about remixing, collaging, and this turned into his own research project, which is the use of cultural heritage imagery. So these like public use collections that museums put out or cultural institutions put out that allow folks to reuse images. And this conversation about the metadata of those images has come up, which is like related to this conversation of data sets and what is archive, what is data set. And yesterday there was a conversation, oh my God, there's so many threads I'm realizing in my head. Yesterday there was a conversation with Goose, who runs the Ancestral AI research thread. And they were talking about, there was two artists from Brazil talking about the use of generative AI in Black imaginaries or Brazilian indigenous imaginaries. And this conversation of metadata or labeling or what is a data set keeps repeating. And there's a couple of threads that have resonated in this conversation. One, who decides what the image is about? So when you're talking about feeding an image in or like data into a model that's created it, there is signifiers, there's inputs, there's metadata about that data. And it's important, it's an old question if you think about museums as archives or curators in creating data sets of who gets to decide what the thing is, who gets to decide where it came from, what is real, who is attributed to, what the context is. And the question that we're working through in this research project is, what are the responsibilities that image makers should consider, might consider, can consider when taking fragments from existing images to create new images, right? This is not a new question, this is collaging. But what, in a world of feeding, of taking, this is the like how diffusion works, right? Taking fragments of images, decontextualizing it, and then creating new images. What is our responsibility? This is definitely not answered, active question. So if anyone has any insights or references you want to point me to, holla. What happens in that decontextualization of like using the fossil, like the imprint of like what was originally there to create a new thing? And the second thing that we're thinking about is like, what are some ways that we can rewrite the metadata in these public archives so that they represent more of what I don't know, we call the cultural logic or the cultural norms of today, which might be different from 40 years ago, 60 years ago, when the original archival metadata was written, which is then encoded, which is then like uploaded, which is then reused in our training. So thinking like a wikithon of metadata for cultural archives, which sounds incredibly boring, I know, but also might be fun. So yeah, it feels like a lot of avenues in my brain are talking about what is data set, what is archive, what is metadata, who gets to decide, are there ways to like have layers of it? Are there ways to have many? I'm not sure if anyone has the answers here, but feel free to word vomit into the chat or unmute.
I mean, as someone like, yeah. Okay, so but as like as someone who likes, I do create a lot of collages for a lot of random parts of my work, and I don't know, I decontextualize from archives and then I don't feel guilty anymore because I can always trace the author most of the time. I don't know how other people do it because I've over the years doing this has just given me guilt if I can't cite someone. I feel it, and then I feel if anyone thinks if anyone's going to take me seriously, they're going to be like, where is this from? And I'll have to say it somewhere. But that's just a ghost that lives in my mind. But I guess so if we could release AI from these productive, unusual, and I don't know, I remember, I think it was Linda when you said if we could release AI from I don't know, the certain pressure either to perform for Vera, to perform for certain things, like what would it look like? I find this question kind of interesting because that's where I got like the fractals and the fragments from. I am one of those people who really likes fractals. It's like really embarrassing because it just looks like weed, like images when you're like high. But I do really like them because mathematically, like if you get into fractals, they'll be like fractals are everything and they're everywhere all the time. But then in terms of like how mathematically they work, I look at that, and I feel that AI would be so suited to this type of movement or even type of shape or form, and then it would be like the real work would be finding out where it actually applies. That's my idea of what, if I were to release AI from making influencers and stuff, what it could look like instead. I don't know, Vera, if you have an idea of what that means for you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the releasement came from the fact that when I did my project in training object detection models in a specific subjective way. So, for example, with a group of students, we would research fascinations, their own fascinations, through training them to an object detection model. So we would ask them to collect their own data sets of their own research interests. So we gave them some ground rules saying okay, so it needs to be a scene, it needs to be some coherence, it needs to be 100 images, it needs to be one overarching topic, but it needs to be your topic. And then they would annotate, we would try, and we do the whole session of them trying to find labels that would, describe what they would see in these images. And it would be a very long and stretched thing. And we would take days of labeling them together, and it became almost this like therapy session. And then they would realize like, oh, I'm labeling this one word like uncanny all the time, but then I start to realize it's not uncanny anymore because I've been seeing it so many times. It's changing. So I saw this whole more fluid approach of AI opened up ways of thinking about yourself. So I feel like the releasement of this perfect model is a kind of like an enrichment for yourself, maybe, or some kind of realization that you have such a big role to play in how these systems function. And if you would give my project, for example, to a computer scientist, which I tried many times, yes, exactly like a self-reflection tool, they would say, you're making a random system. You're making a system that's not working. You're making a system that doesn't perform. The reason why it's showing the results that it's showing is not because you trained it like this, but just because it's a random thing. And then I would always challenge them saying like, yeah, but what is performativity? Like, when do you think a model works perfect? That depends on what goal you have for such a system, right? So if the goal is, hey, I have a self-driving car that needs to detect road signs, we really want them to detect road signs because otherwise, shit happens. But if the goal is not a very specific goal, but it's a fluid thing, like, okay, we want to reflect on it, or we want to see if it can recognize themes, or maybe recognize some level of colors that stem from the way I look at images. I think in that way, you still kind of understand the math because you do teach the system something of you, so the system does learn something of you. But I feel like the goal makes it a little bit less, I don't know how you say, perfect or something. But I do think it's important to understand how these systems work and why these systems, if you use it in this way, it doesn't work similarly as if you would use it for a self-driving car. But in this way, I feel like we can find new functions for these models, or even use it as a provocation, saying like, if you want to use a tool for such a goal, these type of systems, machine learning based systems, are not suitable, or systems based that learn from data are not suitable for the specific tasks we want them to do. Are there any other mathematical models that we could use for the goals that we want, right? So I guess that's maybe a little bit my idea of releasing it from perfection and performance levels, p-values and graphs and everything. And even though I do understand them, I sometimes think like, and for example, ground truth, that's also a word that they tend to use a lot. Yeah, this is the ground truth. And then it's like, but what is ground truth? What does that mean in a model baseline? What is the ground truth? That doesn't even exist, in real life. And then the scary thing is that the people that are actually developing these models, they tend not to really think about it. They think about model performance. That's their main goal. And I feel like us as a group of people kind of showing them different ways to go about and trying to create a dialogue like, hey, what if the goal is this? Or hey, what if I train my model like this? What does that mean? And opening up the discussion, then maybe we can actually think about, okay, what type of models, how does this math needs to work for us? Yeah, maybe that's my vision on this.
I don't know if you want to contribute, Linda. You don't have to, but if you have any ideas.
Yeah, there were a few streams of thought that came up as Vera was speaking. The first one is, when I think about what releasing the pressure they have currently means, I can't help but think about who was AI made for and why. And the sort of push to commercialize only makes sense if it becomes a productivity tool, as in, you're in a company, you need to do things faster. You're a designer, you use Midjourney for this. Like it just makes work better, not even better, just faster. It makes people like, I remember before some of these tools were commercialized, we would talk about AI and talk about a world where, when we have the ability for machines to do some of these things, we get more rest time. We actually have less rest time. We're just doing more with the time we have, right? So it's like, the sort of techno-capitalist dream of humans being replaced by machines so more can be done isn't actually that believable given the path we're taking. To me, the pressure is really about making tools that enhance the bottom line for companies that exist today. If that wasn't the goal, if we didn't rush to commercialization so fast, I think we would have more time, like what was happening before, like ChatGPTs of this world came up, was that there were lots of different approaches that were being surfaced at the same time. Like we know an LLM now and a diffusion model, but those weren't the only like theories or speculation that at some point existed for how AI could work. Like when we say AI today, it really means like AIs. There are many different ways to approach the question of artificial intelligence, right? And a lot of the stuff that's commercialized today, there's so much pressure to make it work that we start to hide the fact that they're so consuming from like an ecological standpoint. Like they're inefficient, they just work badly, and they need more and more resources to make them work like faster. It's astounding to me that we have to cobble up more processors to make something work, as opposed to say, if we have to keep increasing the amount of processors we use, maybe we should have think of a different math to make it work, like a different system to make it work, right? No, we're not saying that because somebody's making money off of it. We're just like, we have to make it work. Use as much as you can, like increase the data, like the server farms, like just let's extract to make this work. And then once it works, whenever that is, we'll think about the ecological impact, and maybe that AI itself will solve it for us. Like, come on. It just seems like the same kind of arguments that you have with usually just any kind of like industrial or technological advancement in the past that has relied so much on extraction of like ecological resources. It's like the end will justify the means, and then the end never actually justifies the means. So when you said releasing the pressure, to me, that's the first pressure I saw. It's like we've moved from this exciting theoretical landscape to this like we're stuck with what we have now. Let's just make it work at all costs. And then the other thread was how do you use what exists today? What I love about that is like, what I love about what you said, Vera, is about the idea of like breaking models, using them for things they're not intended to be used for, as a way to almost like fantasize, right? Like, especially if you're not like, an AI engineer and you can't build your own model from scratch, like you can't think of a new theory of how AI should work. The only thing you can do is break what already exists and use it as a way to say like, it's kind of a resistance. Like I'm here and this is what I think I want to do. And I'm going to use this thing that doesn't work for it, but do it anyway. Right. So like, I think that there's so much beauty in that. Like I recently did a project where I was looking at a diffusion model to do some lettering. Like if you've ever used a diffusion model, hands, they've gotten better at hands, but the one thing they can do is write, even though seemingly the data set they're trained on includes a lot of typography, but it's just the beauty of like a diffusion model. It's so specific and narrow in how it thinks about form that it cannot recognize because letters kind of break that, right? A little bit. It's like letters are form, but humans are really good at taking form and attaching meaning to it. And if you try to do a project like that with a diffusion model, if you try to do a lettering exercise with a diffusion model, it's very frustrating until you discover that that's actually the beauty. It's like, it doesn't know how to do this one thing, and like exploit that and try to figure out like, is there a way you can push it? Like you can fine tune it to not make letters perfectly, but come up with new kinds of letters, right? Like if it's an averaging effect, or if you can, because right now it has, for example, like a Roman alphabet bias, like you always only see a Roman alphabet unless the prompt is specifically about a different kind of geography. How do you start to infuse ancient scripts? How does it react to that? Some that are more geometrical even than like Roman alphabet. Things like that I think are so much fun to work on and show people the limitations of the model, instead of like when I show my mother a photo that was generated on Midjourney, she's like, oh my God, I can't tell that was AI. It's so real. But when I show her these other things that is not suited to make, she's like, that's shit. And I'm like, yes, they are also like able to produce really bad outputs, but the process of sort of like engaging with them on that front not only like demystifies it for people who are new to this technology, but if you are not new and trying to experiment, it's like there's so much poetry in that, I think.
Nice. Okay, so the time has kind of flown by, and we have maybe 10 minutes to the hour. I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions or make any contributions about their own experience of AI or data or art process and reflection. Victor?
Like I love the idea of using algorithms, try to break them and using them in forms that they were not intended to. But I also would like to maybe connect back to Vera's question of what is small, and then actually the first time I was thinking about this was a number from Vera, 500. Vera was a guest in my project, and we were thinking about how many pictures of pantries do you need to train basically a recipe generator. It seems like there's very similar things, Vera, that you also do with participants when you train, when you label the data, and then the question you addressed about what are alternatives to this ultimate optimization drive, and when training an algorithm to distribute food, a flexibility from the participants' side seemed to be a buffer for optimization, in the sense that people were taking pride in being able to cook flexibly, in a sense, like if you have the skill to cook seasonally, you might also develop a skill set to cook with whatever ingredients the algorithm throws at you, and you're happy to experiment a little bit, and maybe the fully optimized food item delivery would also like result in a very boring cuisine. So on that end, this scenario of distributing food items and people cooking allowed for something that didn't need to be ultimately optimized. But this didn't answer the question of what's big enough, or what's big enough of a data set that if we enter it and label it, the response of the algorithm doesn't seem completely random. And I think that's the moment we didn't find it. And this is what I took from this experiment. When you start to feel that you entered the data, you delivered, you provided data, you label the data, and you taught and retaught the algorithm, and it starts to feel not random. You start to feel that the labor and the decisions you put into the data generation and data labeling start to somehow correspond with what you expected as a response. This is when you probably had big enough data sets and enough labels. We didn't get there. So this gap between but you both of you, I think, confirm that you need to start to train big. And then when you start with doing it yourself, you have small data sets. That for me, this is still the zone to explore, like what's still small, situated, community specific, site specific, but already big enough to feel random.
I don't know if anyone has any questions or contributions. I don't know I don't know. I can't actually answer because I do work with I used to work with some data sets with Wikimedia, but they would just produce such like fragmented results, and I enjoyed it because I just like cutting them out and then fragmenting them even more. But that's not really productive. But I don't know if anyone else has any other questions or interests, or you just want to give a shout. If not, then I might wrap up our chat because it's been about an hour, but I honestly found this really, really interesting, and I'm so grateful for the contributions of Vera and Linda and Victor and Ploy. Thank you guys for carrying this conversation. If no one wants to open their mic and say something else, I'm gonna close and say like a big thank you. Oh yeah, someone asked, Vera, is there a place to read your thesis?
Ew. I'm just kidding, Vera.
Okay, well. Thanks guys. Thank you for the comments. I find them very nice to read as I'm stuttering through. But thank you guys for participating. I super appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. I always get a bit scared about facilitating these chats, if it's gonna be like pulling teeth or if it's gonna go pretty well and like learn new things, which I did today. So thank you so much, and have a really great, today's Wednesday. Have a really great Wednesday afternoon, night. Bye guys.